Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Watch Jay Kelly December 5th, only on Netflix.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster and we are in our Regency era. This season we're talking all about what was going on in Britain in the early 1800s, aka the Regency era, aka when you picture Bridgerton or Jane Austen movies, that time period. Empire waistline dresses, people dancing around to remixes of Billie Eilish and that sort of thing. It's an era that, in this first part of the season, I really wanted to jump in and explain the reality of it before we really get going into looking at some of the stories of this time, because it is a time and a place that a lot of people know of from things like Bridgerton and from Jane Austen novels and just novels of that time. And it's the same as if people read novels of this time. If someone read Sally Rooney or something and thought, well, that's exactly what life was like, where it's like, yeah, that is a world that is recognizable to us, but that's not the daily lived experience of most people. Or even if you read like Daniel Steele or James Patterson. Anyway, there's something about the Regency era where I, myself included, just you like to imagine going to the ball and dancing around and how everybody has all this etiquette and manners and everything's kind of nice and polite. And it was not like that. No era in history has ever actually been like that. And so I was really excited to come across this book. So today we're talking with author Zoë McGee, who wrote a new book that's called Courting Disaster, Reading Between the Lines of the Regency Novel. And the tagline on the cover of the book, I think, really succinctly explains what her book is about. Because every novel about marriage is a novel about consent. And what she's looking at in this book are issues of sexual consent, sexual assault in the Regency era, as portrayed in fictional novels of the time. It was such a fascinating book. I was really excited when Zoe agreed to come be on the podcast to talk about it, because I think it really helps dissect this time period, kind of our understanding of how we imagine it was, what it was really like, and how much you can really learn about a time period from what goes unsaid sometimes in Jane Austen novels and other novels of the time. I think it's also really interesting because we have talked about writers from this era, Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, Jane Austen herself. There's going to be other authors were coming up. And so this was a time where more women were writing, which is really interesting to see how the stories are portrayed through the point of view of women and their lived experience. Anyway, it's such a fascinating conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy hearing from Zoë McGee about her book, Courting Disaster. So I'm joined today by Zoë McGee, who is the author of the new book, Courting Disaster, Reading Between the Lines of the Regency Novel. Welcome, Zoë.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I'm so excited to talk to you about this research and for everybody to hear about what you're talking about in your book. Can you explain, however you explain this to people usually, what's your book about?
So like the sort of elevator pitch version is like, what does the Me Too movement have to do with Jane Austen? And then also like what storytelling has to do with our consent activism. Like how have things actually changed from the past? How are they much closer to the past than we might like them to be? And how do we still use storytelling as like a key tool in talking about consent?
And I think what's really, I read your book and I found it also fascinating. And part of what was interesting to me as well was you're talking about several books that I've heard of, but I haven't read. So you're kind of explaining, there's a lot of spoilers in your book for people
who have a lot of spoilers.
Who don't want to be spoiled for books from like 300 years ago. But just the way that you explain the plot lines and what's happening in them, I'm just like, oh my gosh, what happens next? But also the way that now as well as then, you can learn things about a society and what a culture is like by looking at the fiction that they read and how they tell these stories. Facts that you're going to find. Maybe you won't find this in like a list of court cases. Maybe you're not going to find out what people were really up to, but in a novel, you can see there's a reason why they wrote this story, and then there's a reason why people act the way that they do in this book, and it can speak to what society was maybe like. And that's what I find really interesting in terms of your work. And what I'm trying to do this season, talking about the Regency era, and people think of it as this time where everybody was so well behaved, and everybody there's such etiquette, and there are all these rules, and everybody obeyed them all the time. But that wasn't the case. And you look at so many examples in your book about how that wasn't the case. Actually, can we start by just talking about the book Pamela? Because I feel like that's kind of you say in your book it's the first modern novel or something like that, or it's an early
novel.
Yeah.
It's by Samuel Richardson, and it was incredibly popular at the time. It's probably like my least favorite novel that I read from that time period, just because of the plot. But what it does is it takes this sort of story of a young virtuous girl who goes off to work as a servant in this master's house, and he starts sort of pursuing her sexually, and she is very virtuous, so she's not interested, and he kind of gets increasingly determined that he is going to have sex with her, and he kind of ends up kind of enlisting the help of this madam, his housekeeper, to kind of help him restrain Pamela and have his way with her. And then she's so good that he can't go through with it. And her morality saves her. And subsequently, he then decides, actually, I should probably try and marry her instead. Which is just that's why I don't get on with it so well, because it doesn't feel like a happy ending to I think to our sensibilities. It's a novel told through letters, so it's one of these epistolary novels, and it gets really quite weird because Pamela's writing these letters and she's sending them out, but she's also having to hide them. And so she kind of tucks them all into like her bodice, and she keeps them like very close to her skin because you didn't have a lot of private, secure space in the 18th century. But then her employer finds them, and he's holding them and thinking about how they've been like warmed by her skin. So that's creepy in its own way. But then you're holding the book that is in theory the letters. So there's this kind of weird chain of kind of body contact through the pages. But that novel, it kind of bridges for me between the novels that we kind of tend to think of as being like active plots about and stories and characters, and these sort of conduct manuals that the 18th century had, which were these kind of guides on how to behave. You might give it to your young female relative, and she could read it and learn important lessons about how she was supposed to be dutiful and how she was supposed to be obedient. And so Richardson started writing Pamela, and the kind of aim, at least in theory, was a guide on how to write good letters. So you would read Pamela and you'd learn how to write letters well, because letter writing was kind of a huge part of how people communicated and how you got news and entertainment and things like that. So you wanted to be able to write a good letter, but it kind of morphed along the way into this story that ended up sort of I guess it's hard to say about like what he intends for it to be, but Pamela as a character is incredibly moral and kind of unrealistically so. She's this paragon of behavior, and it is her goodness that saves her. And she's in theory like rewarded with what she deserves by then getting to marry this wealthy man, even though he is not a great person. It's something that the time period also didn't necessarily take seriously. So while the book was incredibly popular, it also had a huge number of parodies. So there are books coming out called like Shamala and things like that are all about this sort of conniving, devious, very knowing girl, like out to snare her master and use her wiles to kind of trap him into marriage. So it wasn't something that the 18th century necessarily went, oh yes, this is like a totally plausible thing. But it sets up Richardson's kind of his huge novel, Clarissa, which is sort of a real cornerstone for talking about consent and novels in the 18th century.
Well, and I do want to talk about Clarissa, absolutely. Not just, you said his big novel, but you describe it in your book. It's just like it's a doorstopper of a magnum opus. But in terms of Pamela and the fact that it was really popular, I found that really interesting. And I did an episode a bit ago with Alexandra Vasti talking about like Regency era sex education and how did young women learn about sexuality, the threat that sex can pose from certain men. And a lot of it was from these novels. So Pamela, the fact that it was popular, I found that interesting in the context of, I think, for people who don't research the Regency era, but people who watched season 1 of Bridgerton will remember that the character of Daphne didn't know what sex was. And so people feel like, wow, can you believe that back then people didn't even know what sex was? And it's like, well, maybe some people didn't, but anyone who read a novel would have. And a lot of people read these novels. So do you know what cross-section of society who would have read these novels? Was it mostly wealthier people? Or I guess that's who would have the time to read a novel, really.
Yeah, and would have the education to be kind of more literate. Like literacy rates weren't universal in the 18th century as well. I think you had a lot of like the nobility reading it. You'd have a lot of the genteel kind of more upper middle section reading it. So, people would put quotes on their fans and then be like wafting them across the ballroom. But books are expensive in this time period. So you do have to be able to either afford them or afford to like be joined to a circulating library or something like that.
I love the idea. So I'm just picturing the quotes written on fans. That's so much like now people get a sweatshirt or something, or they just have their like phone case has like a quote from their favorite book. Like it's just people have always read a book and wanted to let everybody know I've read this book and I like it, and everybody needs to know that. That just reminds me of today a little bit.
And also the same kind of posturing of like, maybe I haven't read this book, maybe I have, but if I'm carrying it around the park, it'll look like I'm really intellectual and I'm like in with the zeitgeist and I know what's going on. And that kind of popularity feeds on itself as well.
That's true. And so Pamela was the it book of that point. But then Clarissa, you were saying, is, I read your book, so I know what happens in Clarissa. It's like quite ongoing saga. It's quite a lengthy series of perils of Clarissa that she goes through. So set the scene. So Pamela is popular, and then Clarissa comes out, and that's even more popular, clearly.
Clarissa is about 33% longer than War and Peace. It was like the longest novel ever published in the English language. It's absolutely huge. And so she does have a lot of things to go through in that many pages. I think we were talking about like what lessons you might learn from the novels. And I think what we see is that Pamela as a book kind of tells you that if you're really good, you'll be fine. And I think Clarissa's really interested in this question of this issue that you can be really good and not be fine. And also that you can be slightly less than perfect and still deserve to be fine. So Clarissa is like Pamela, she's very virtuous. She's got a bit more spirit than Pamela in some ways. She's kind of caught in this impossible situation where she's got a family who don't appreciate her and are trying to marry her off, and a suitor who she doesn't want to marry, but is starting to seem like the better option than her family, because her family have decided she needs to do exactly what they're telling her, and they're locking her up and they won't let her out and they won't let her do anything. She ends up meeting Lovelace, who is the villain of the book. And she ends up meeting him at night, and she knows she shouldn't really be doing this, but she's also kind of got very few options. So she kind of takes this meeting with him in the garden, and then he stages things to make it look like they've been discovered. And she's not planning on running away with him or anything, but when the noise starts and she starts thinking they're being chased, she goes with him, because at that point, if she's found with him, it's going to be really bad for her. So she starts running away, and he starts like dragging her along with him and dragging her into his carriage, and she is screaming like, no, no, no. But it's still kind of, she can't help but be dragged into this carriage. And from there, he takes her away, and she is basically imprisoned for most of the book. So Lovelace has this idea, like life thesis, that all virtue is corruptible. And so what he is trying to do is take someone like Clarissa, who is extremely virtuous and good, and show that she can be corrupted. He's kind of got her in his power, And over the course of the book, it's sort of like, when is he going to sleep with her? When is the sort of sexual deviancy going to corrupt her? It's an interesting one because you do have a few times where he's sort of in proximity to her and thinks about raping her and decides not to at that point. And that's quite interesting, like having just talked about Pamela and her goodness kind of putting off her employer, because Richardson is really clear in Clarissa that although Clarissa's trying to say all the right things to kind of make Lovelace back off, Lovelace is making the decision of whether he attacks her or not. And at that point, he decides he's not going to. But it's very explicit in the text that she can't say magic words that will make this okay, which I think is such a powerful thing when we do think about novels as an educative tool. Like, it's something we don't like to think about, that in a scenario where you're being attacked, the only person who can make the decision about what's going to happen is your attacker. And it would be much nicer if there was something you could say or do that would keep you safe, but there isn't. What Richardson goes on to do with Clarissa is she does end up being raped by Lovelace, but she is drugged unconscious at the time. This is really interesting from a legal perspective, because in 18th century law, rape required like the utmost resistance. So it wasn't enough to prove that you had resisted to show that you weren't consenting. You had to prove that you had resisted enough, which made the burden of proof really difficult in a court of law. There were all sorts of ways people would like to pick holes in victims' arguments. But you had to prove resistance for it to count as rape. And with Clarissa being unconscious, there is no way you can say that she's resisted, because she's drugged, she's out cold. So you can't say that she has technically performed resistance correctly, but also it's very clear that like she hasn't consented and she has been raped. So Richardson is kind of highlighting here that there's a real flaw in the legal system and in the way that resistance requirement is problematic. And I think that's just such an interesting stance for a book to take, and a book by a male author as well, because a lot of the people I was looking at in this time period are women. And actually Richardson was very popular and had a lot of fans who then wrote in at the end of the book and said to him, actually, you need to change it. You need to make her marry Lovelace. You need to reform him at the end so that they can end up together, because he's one of these like rake characters. He's quite dashing and charming, apart from the fact that he's an absolutely terrible person. And so what Richardson does is he kind of goes back and he adds to the book, and he adds these footnotes and he adds these notes. And he does this a few times, trying to say, like, this is not the person you should want your heroine to be marrying. And the people writing to him, were women too. Like, he had a whole mixture of readers. But he was really clear that you weren't supposed to make all of this kind of go away and be unproblematic. Like, it was a problem. It was not the behavior you wanted your heroine to end up like marrying the man for. And what he talks about to one of his readers, he writes back to, I think her name's Lady Bradshaw. He says he wanted his heroine to be like imperfect, but not in intention. So Clarissa doesn't do everything right. Like, she does take this meeting with Lovelace in the garden at night, which, technically she probably shouldn't have done. But what he's really clear about is like, just because she's done something that could be a mistake doesn't mean she deserves the rest of this treatment. It's not about, this isn't a story of her like falling, and it's not like a warning tale of how not to be this fallen woman. It's very much saying, like, even if you do something slightly wrong, you can still be harmed, and she's still really good and she's still really virtuous. And actually, the things that someone does to you can't take that away from you as a person. It's something that Lovelace finds really confusing, because he attacks Clarissa and then he's expecting her to be changed afterwards. He's expecting her to be like full of vice and corrupt now that she's had this sexual experience, and she's not. She's still her. So then he's like, oh, maybe I need her to be conscious, so that maybe she can be aware while this change is happening. Because he's a terrible person. But you kind of get this real sense from Richardson that like Clarissa's value as a sort of an intrinsic moral being isn't diminished by this attack on her, which is really important in a time where a lot of, I talk about this in a later bit of the book about honor and virtue, but a lot of women's value was kind of commodified by their virginity. And the fact that she's shown to be still like a whole person in that regard is really powerful.
Well, and I do want to talk about that. Towards the end of your book, you're talking about legal cases and legal records and things like that. And that's where I think what you've been talking about and what you do in the book is so powerful, or to show like, here's what's happening in these novels, and here's the sorts of sexual assault cases that ended up making it to court. And the same as today, like there's so many cases of sexual assault that never make it that far. People don't report it, or they're not believed, or whatever. So it's interesting, like if you could talk about what you found from the sorts of people who ended up going to court being charged versus the sorts of people in the novels. Like the people in the novels are mostly high class, rich men, and the people going to court are not that. So it's interesting to show that the novels might be portraying a truth about society that we're not going to get from the court records because of who ends up having the means to actually charge somebody.
Yeah, it was so. I mean, it sounds terrible to say it was so interesting because it was, it was quite difficult reading, and it hits very differently when you are like so aware that it's people's lives. But it was really interesting seeing that like the novels do generally all have this focus on like a higher class bracket, and also on. So like we just talked about how Clarissa has this unconsciousness that doesn't sit well with the legal system. They're often, when they have issues around consent, it's often in grey areas that like wouldn't necessarily play amazingly well in court. I feel like the novels are often talking about where people's sensibilities were, which are always further ahead than like the legal system. The legal system needs kind of minds to change and then legislative change to come in. So it is always slower. But when you actually look at the courts, yeah, there were very few cases actually being brought. So I took a 50-year window at the Old Bailey, which is one of the big courts in London. And they had 24 guilty verdicts for rape in that 50-year window, which is just kind of unrealistically low. And they had sort of under 200 cases actually being brought in the first place. So it was a very small number of cases that actually make it to court. And so part of that is people need to have enough money to be able to go to trial, which rules out like the sort of bottom end of the social scale. But they also need to not be so wealthy or genteel that their reputation is more valuable. It's so that you won't necessarily go to court as a lady to say, you've been attacked sexually, because that's going to make your value to your family and your reputation be much less. So it would be more common that you would either hide it and not talk about it and hope that either nobody knew or everyone would pretend not to know, or you would marry quickly either to the person involved. So then it just sort of cancels out a little bit sort of socially, because the social issue is the sex before marriage, not quite as much the fact that you've been attacked. So yeah, you kind of be married off either to the person who's attacked you or to someone else who you can kind of quickly get into a marriage with. So you don't have a lot of the nobility there, and you also don't have a lot of married women. And I think I found one case in this period where the victim was married. There was a few where you don't get huge amounts of information, so like there might be some more than that, but with this married woman, she was also charging like a carriage robbery, and actually they convicted the criminals of the robbery and then didn't try the rest of the case. So they didn't actually follow through on that sort of rape charge. But you wouldn't really get that many married women, because as a woman who was married, you wouldn't be able to charge your partner because you signed over consent at the time you got married. So marital rape wasn't a thing, legally speaking. It wasn't criminalized in the UK until the 1990s. I think it was also the 1990s in the US, but a few years later. It's sort of a much later thing. So that rules out a lot of the people who would have been kind of committing these crimes. And then you have the fact that women didn't kind of have legal existence in the courtroom. If they were married, their husbands would have to bring the case for them. So this then has to be something that is worth the expense of taking it to court, the convincing of your husband, if that's a factor you have to take into account, and the kind of ordeal of actually going into this public courtroom and having all these very difficult things discussed. It's an ordeal kind of whatever time period you do it in, but it's not a gentle time. One of the things that kind of really brought home how difficult it would be to kind of go through that court process is that you often have to have a medical exam. And the medical exams are a lot less sophisticated than ours are now. So to go through this kind of re-traumatization of being poked and prodded by these doctors who are looking for very specific things to count as the way that they kind of decide whether it looks like someone has suffered this type of violence is quite specific and quite rigid. And you see cases where there will be like a medical dismissal with a kind of lens of what we know now more, like we would think maybe that's an overly hasty ruling. I don't know how graphic it's okay to be talking about this, so I'm trying to kind of dance around things a bit.
You can be as graphic as you are in the book in this conversation.
Okay, so a lot of the exams to determine whether you've been raped or not include things like, have you suffered like a particular kind of laceration? If your body isn't torn up enough, it's seen as like that there hasn't been sufficient harm done or that you haven't resisted enough. But you also get cases where they're saying, oh, well, you are not a virgin woman. You shouldn't be having these issues. You should be used to it. So this is suspicious in itself. It's quite bleak, but you also know that they don't have like tools to be doing these investigations. So it's all kind of manual and hands-on, which is not what you would necessarily want to go and do. One of the things that really kind of came up was this question of resistance and consent. And so the cases that were sort of more generally successful were the cases that had less to prove in terms of consent. So a lot of the cases involve children, and a lot of the cases involve venereal disease. Because if the victim is underage, you just have to prove that the event's taken place, right? You don't have to show whether they resisted or not because they're below the age of consent. And then if there is some kind of STI present, you can say, oh, well, look, they've got this venereal disease. They've clearly had sexual contact because they've suddenly got this STI. And there were a lot of children who were victims at this time because there was this kind of folk belief that you could cure STIs by having sex with someone who was innocent. So you often will have the doctors kind of explicitly asked about whether that's true so that they have a platform to say, this is not true, don't do that, please stop doing that, it's really bad. I found that like a lot of the people going through the courts, a lot of the cases involved children, a lot of the cases involved STIs. And a lot of the cases were in this bracket where they were either servants or like working at a public house, or they had some income enough to pay for a case, but not so much that their like marital prospects would be a significant financial transaction, if that makes sense.
I also just want to let everybody know that the age of consent was 11 at this point.
The age of consent is really strange at this point because there's 3. So if you're a boy, it's 14. If you're a girl, it's 11 or 12, depending on the day. It's kind of a legal oddity, but there were these 2 different bits of law. And depending on which judge you got, depended on which bit of the law they were listening to. And so there are some cases where the victim is sort of 11 or is 12 and is tried as an adult. And there are some where they're 12 and are treated as a child. So it's very much a little bit luck of the draw as to which one you got. But it's incredibly young.
Yeah, no, and in reading your book, you're like, oh, and when people were underage, this was this and that. And then you mentioned, oh, and that was 11. I was like, wait, what? Like that's the age of consent?
Yikes. Yeah.
No, it was hard to read. And actually, one of the things that I noticed going through it was you kind of get, if you're just reading a lot of these cases one after the other, there's a certain amount that you desensitize to just kind of be able to look through them all. And the language is quite dry. But also, people are very euphemistic in the 18th century. Like they are in their novels anyway, we know, but they also are within court. So this is a space where they're like supposed to be as explicit as possible. And you still get a lot of euphemism just to describe kind of everything, whether it's like, oh, he showed me his thing, or like, this is the part, or I think someone described someone as having a great deal of human nature about them. You're using a lot, there's a lot of this language, and part of that obscures how extremely violent these cases were. So it's not just that these were cases that were coming to court because they felt like they had a good chance of getting a verdict, and very few of those still managed it. But particularly of the ones that did, you really see like it's all violent. It's already a violent act, but you see some quite extreme elements, particularly when you think like, oh, you need to have like this laceration on your body to prove this has happened, or there's some element. There was a story which was a piece of testimony by these two women who gave testimony together because they were attacked together. And so you actually have a kind of bigger picture of that particular case because you've got these two voices and they do some incredible testifying. It's much more emotive than a lot of the cases, and they are very clear about how, although they weren't necessarily being physically restrained, they weren't able to leave this situation. They were taken around town and they kept being taken to different pubs, and they couldn't leave, and they kept saying, I wanted to go home. We wanted to go home. And it was so powerful hearing them talk about just wanting to get out, basically, but also the fact that the court let that stand. Like one of the lawyers kind of comes back and says, well, nobody was holding you down, like you could have left, and that kind of gets battered away quite quickly. And they recognize that these women were not able to get out of this situation, even though technically they were not being like restrained. You kind of get a sense of the court recognizing things like coercion. You get like little hints of it coming through these cases, which was really, really interesting. But they are incredibly violent, and that's obscured by the language a lot of the time.
And now for a quick advertising break. Oh, hello. You may have heard of HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit in America that makes home cooking easier with chef-crafted recipes and fresh ingredients delivered straight to your door. You might have heard me say that I like to get my food from them, and that's true, and I do. And here's a couple of reasons why I'm really happy to get HelloFresh, especially this time of year. So they've got lots of options. They've doubled their menu from what they used to have. So this is like, we're talking 100 different options each week, which for like a picky person like myself is huge. Maybe you're a picky person. Maybe you live with somebody who's a picky person. You can have different options. You can try all these kinds of meals, find which ones are your favorite. And these include new seasonal dishes and recipes from around the world. That's right. They have new recipes from their global street eats kitchen featuring local favorites from around the world, which I love that, I'm living here in a place in North America where it's cold, so I like to eat food and imagine that I'm somewhere else, warmer and not here. The food is also healthier than it used to be, so we're talking 15 plus high protein recipes each week. They also help you eat greener with new veggie packed recipes that have 2 or more veggies per dish. And in fact, do you have children? 3 out of 4 parents say their kids eat more veggies with HelloFresh because it's so good, because like everything is a part of the same meal, and they kind of like the vegetables are included and they're kind of hidden a little bit, which I find also helpful for myself. These meals are also tastier than they used to be. You can get steak and seafood recipes delivered every week for no extra cost. There's 3 times the seafood options that there used to be. What I'm talking about is like, it's bigger, it's better, and honestly, when it's cold outside, do you want to go to the grocery store, haul home all these bags? I don't. Are you going on holiday? This is my pro tip. If you join HelloFresh and then schedule it so when you come back from your holiday, the box is there, then you don't have to go grocery shopping when you're all jet lagged. It all works out really well for everybody. Anyway, so the best way to cook just got better. Go to hellofresh.com/vulgarhistory10fm now to get 10 free meals and a free breakfast for life. 1 per box with active subscription. Free meals applied as discount on first box. New subscribers only. Varies by plan. That's hellofresh.com/vulgarhistory10fm to get 10 free meals and free breakfast for life. And just to clarify, it's vulgarhistory10fm. You don't write out the word 10. Anyway, Vulgar History, HelloFresh, match made in heaven.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies just to see if you could save some cash? Well, Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
If you've shopped online, it's extremely likely that you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes the process from, I think I'm ready to buy, to, I can't wait till it gets here, so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. It gives you a leg up from the very beginning, with hundreds of beautiful, ready-to-go templates to express your brand style, so you don't have to spend time coding a website. Shopify allows you to tackle all the important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. Plus, they have built-in marketing and email tools to help find and keep new customers, so you can easily spread your brand's word. And did I mention that iconic purple Shop Pay button that's used by millions of businesses around the world? It's the reason why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. Your customers already know it, love it, and actually use it. If you want to see less carts being abandoned, it's time for you to head over to Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. Shopify.com/realm.
It's 77 soccer. Smaller the pitch, faster the action. The world's elite soccer clubs compete for their share of a massive $5 million prize. Catch World Sevens on TNT, True TV, and HBO Max December 5th through the 7th.
And we're back. Well, and that's where I think that people might look at this time period and say, like, oh, things used to be better because there was less. You could see the evidence of the fact that there was less court cases for sexual assault, meaning that there was less sexual assault, which is part of where people might think, oh, things were nicer then, things were kinder then, they were gentler then. It's like, no, people didn't report things and people weren't believed. That doesn't mean they weren't happening. And that's why I think it's really interesting. The combination, the way that your book looks at, here's what people are putting in novels, which is either instructive or makes people think about stuff that they've heard happen to other people or things that they know are going on. And when you combine that with, here's what's happening in the court case, it's completely different because the novels are these gray area, these kind of where somebody knows their attacker and maybe it ends up in a marriage, which happens in several of these books. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit about you get into some of Jane Austen's books, which I think people often think about as that's the everybody's well behaved and everybody's nice and let's enjoy this book. And that's like they're lovely books and that's kind of what they're for. But at the same point there's the risk of like somebody being treated like a fiance to somebody who they're not engaged to, for instance, and how that can become a scandal. So like in Sense and Sensibility, for instance, can you talk about some of the issues that you bring up in your book about that?
Yeah. I think one thing you get a sense of is what risks and what threats the authors are treating as understood by their readers. Like there's sort of like what's an assumed level of threat. So like if we were reading a contemporary book and someone's like walking down a dark alley on their, after a trip to the pub or something and they're in a short skirt. Like if you're watching that on a TV show, you're kind of reading cues as to, okay, there might be this thing might happen because I understand this language, or this like visual language of telling me this bad thing is going to happen. And you see across a lot of these novels how easy it was to kind of disappear people in the 18th century almost. Like you don't have the same kind of network of finding people. So if you get pulled into a carriage and run away with to a different part of the country, unless someone is able to go and physically look for you or like has a really good network of people already in the right area, you can just be vanished. It's something the TV show Harlots does a really good job of kind of showing, like that danger of just kind of how transient almost everything is because it's purely physical. You know, your body can be taken away very easily. Your money can be taken away very easily because it's these coins in your hand. And I think by the time we get to Jane Austen, you see something like Sense and Sensibility we get the sense of like, oh, here are Eleanor and Marianne, and they live in a nice big house, and now they're having to move to a smaller cottage. And this is, you know, in many ways, this is like a step down for them. You know, they're having to market and like buy their food carefully. They're having to think about the fact that the chimney smokes, but they also do still have servants, and they still are not working day to day. So they are still fine, but they are kind of in that world. But you see that here's what losing your fortune can look like, and it doesn't look that bad. But then you have a character like Eliza. We see Eliza, who is Colonel Brandon's ward. She is part of this kind of history of women being mistreated and abandoned by men and the repercussions of that. So her mother was left kind of pregnant and without financial support and ends up dying of poverty and of disease, and leaves her child, Eliza, to Colonel Brandon to look after. And so he raises her and treats her as his ward. And then she ends up kind of falling into a similar storyline that her mother did, in that she is also made pregnant and abandoned by, in this case, Willoughby. But she's not going to die in poverty because she has a protector. So you see like a slight improvement on her situation from her mother's. But without Colonel Brandon being there, you can kind of extrapolate that she would be in a horrendous situation. And actually, one of the things that you see in the novel is that Brandon doesn't know where she is for quite a lot of the book. He knows that she ran off with Willoughby, and he's been looking for her, and he's been trying to find where she's got to. And it's only at a certain point that he gets a letter that tells him where she is. So she's disappeared on him and thought, you know, that she was set up and was going to be married and was going to be fine. And then turns out he wasn't planning on going through with that, and he's run off to now find himself an heiress. So I think you see through their kind of mother and daughter storylines the way that it can go really horribly wrong, and the fact that our characters, our like central characters, have more protection around them. It helps us kind of feel like they're safe. But if Marianne had like continued running off with Willoughby, they're not eloping, but like they are acting like an engaged couple. Everyone thinks they're engaged. She's not too fussed about propriety. Like as far as she's concerned, they're getting married. So what's there to worry about? And if you were to ask her about it, she'd be insulted on both her behalf and on Willoughby's behalf that you would think so poorly of him. And if she had kind of just gone slightly further than she should, she also could be in this kind of same position as Eliza, where yes, she has her mother and her sister around, but they are also, you know, they rely on family to a certain extent for support, as well as the inheritance from their father. You know, she would be just as vulnerable as Eliza would be, but she does have her sister kind of there trying to protect her, and probably would be there making some like very practical plans if they had to deal with this. It's not that far off from being a possibility for her So yeah, I think you do get this sense within Austen. Same with there's a moment in Mansfield Park where one of the characters runs off, a married woman runs off with a man who is not her husband. And her sister immediately elopes because her sister has gone, right, if this gets out, I'm never getting married. I will be ruined, so I need to go and make sure that I'm married to someone before there's an issue. And so you don't really know at that point how much she actually wants to. Like, it's a character she's sort of flirted with before. It's not like you don't think she hates this man. But there is also, you've got to ask yourself how much that would have been what she would want to do if there hadn't been this sort of immediate time crunch on the situation. There's a kind of quite a pragmatic, like, this is to keep me safe, this is what I'm going to do situation.
Well, and what happens with, I was just thinking with both Marianne and with Eliza is what happens in so many of the novels that you summarize or you discuss in your book is that the man makes it seem like they are going to get married to get the woman to usually to have sex with them. And then so in those circumstances, it is sort of, it can be seen as sort of an instruction or a warning to young women who are reading these novels. Like, just because a man is acting this way doesn't mean he actually means it, because that's someone like Eliza thought that she was getting married and this is why she did all these things, and to find out that you're not. And there's other much more dramatic situations of that in other novels that you get into in your book of people just really putting on a whole pretense to make it seem like, oh, this is, of course we're getting married and of course we love each other. So, I mean, I don't know, as much as anyone reading a novel or watching a TV show today, although I do think there is something to be said for myself, at least. Like, I learned a lot about dating etiquette and stuff just from watching, Dawson's Creek or whatever. Like, you watch people in these situations to sort of familiarize yourself with, like, what are these situations going to be like? So I could see that these novels would give people, this leads me to my other question, which is just, I wanted to talk a bit about the book Ophelia, and the concept of what could happen to a person who, like that character in Bridgerton, who doesn't know anything about anything, and how the parents could think, well, this is going to protect them, it's going to keep them innocent, but actually it just sets them up to be taken advantage of in other ways because they don't understand what sexual threat is. Could you explain a bit? I just thought this book was so bananas. I just want you to explain it a bit to people.
It's a really funny book, and it's deliberately funny, which is nice when you have a lot of, like, slightly more depressing subject matter. So The History of Ophelia is this very bonkers novel where there's this young girl who is raised in basically complete isolation. She grows up just with her aunt. Somehow the two of them run a farm together, just the two of them. They don't ever seem to do any, like, farm work. They're just reading philosophy books, and somehow the farm runs itself. But when the story starts, a man appears, and it's the first man that she's ever seen. And her aunt is very suspicious because her aunt has met men before, and she doesn't like the way that he is looking at Ophelia. And Ophelia can't understand why her aunt thinks, why her aunt isn't being incredibly welcoming. So her aunt has basically educated her about morality and virtue and the right way to behave, but she hasn't taught her anything about vice, and she hasn't taught her anything about, she just basically doesn't want to, like, corrupt her mind with any negative information. So Ophelia kind of is confused why her aunt isn't being, like, open arms welcoming to this stranger, but she doesn't think that much about it. And then the aunt shoos the stranger away and kind of says, off you go. And he leaves, comes back in the middle of the night and abducts Ophelia because that's a normal thing to do. So he's thrown her over his horse. He's riding off with her. And there's this very clever kind of dialogue that she has with herself. So the book itself is is like a big letter from Ophelia, now a married lady in the future, writing to someone to tell them about her story. And so she's describing what she was thinking at the time that she was very naive. So you can kind of get this sense of now knowing more, but then knowing nothing. And she's sort of running through why someone could possibly have abducted her in the middle of the night. And she's going, well, I don't have any money, so it can't really be robbery. And I don't have any enemies, so it can't really be revenge. So I don't know why they're doing this, but I am scared. But I don't know why I'm scared. And so they dance around this thing of, you know exactly what she should be afraid of. And you can see that she doesn't understand anything about sexual threat, but also that she's sort of innately virtuous enough that she is scared even though she doesn't know why she should be. Like, she can't think of a reason why she should be, but she is. And so you get a lot of this throughout the book of her having the right reactions emotionally to things as like an innate response. But what you end up with is this girl being kind of placed into fashionable society with no idea what her behavior signifies. And so the guy who's abducted her doesn't want to marry her. He doesn't believe in marriage, but he'd quite like to kind of keep her on the side. And so in order to do that, he knows he can't tell her that it's not normal because she's too moral for that. So he pretends to her that he's acting as a guardian and looking after her, and that this is very normal. And he restricts her access to meeting other people so that no one else can tell her that it's not normal. And along the way, everyone else that she meets believes that she is his mistress because she's so open and so friendly and so warm with him. She's not doing any of the like proper behaviors that you're supposed to do. She's too familiar. So her behavior is kind of confirming to everyone that she is this kept mistress, even though she's actually not doing that. She doesn't understand what her behavior is signifying. The book kind of sets up this really interesting, it kind of poses this really interesting like point about how if you get to a point where you are like the absolute most innocent you could possibly be, this kind of parody character, you cannot resist properly and show disinterest properly because you don't understand what it is you're supposed to be trying to resist. So she's never doing or saying the things to put him off because she doesn't get that she's supposed to be putting him off because she doesn't understand that there's a thing that might be coming that she's not putting off. So you kind of have this, it does a couple of things. It's just really fun. So you have first that like this character is ridiculous. Like she's completely absurd. Like nobody is that naive and innocent. And so you can't pick her to pieces and fault her for any of her actions because it's farcically perfect, but it means you move away from let's critique the woman in this scenario, and it means you kind of have to focus on this guy who's abducted her and is keeping. You have to focus on his choices and his decisions and see him as bearing the responsibility. So that's fun in its own way, that it's kind of moving the conversation past what did she do and more going towards, well, what did he do? You also then have this sort of truth that that you have to have a certain amount of knowledge to be able to keep yourself safe, because you need to know what it is you're trying to keep yourself safe from and what things are socially seen as sort of signals. And it's something that was really interesting to me thinking about consent more broadly, because we tend to think, I tend to think that we have consent that we do with words, where we used to think, like, oh, she said no, he said he didn't want to. And then you have consent through behavior. So where we say, oh, well, or she danced with him twice at the ball, so that shows that she's interested in him. And that's obviously a more Regency specific example. But we also have things like, oh, well, if you had dinner if you let them pay for dinner, then you're probably going to want to have sex with them on the date. Kind of, we have our own sort of little ways of reading behavior that are more ingrained than we think they are. And one of the things that I think is really terrifying about the 18th century is that when you break it down, a lot of the behaviors that are seen to show kind of consent and willingness, they're also usually the feminine behaviors, or the ones that are coded as like properly female, because a lot of the sort of appropriate female social response is obedience, acceptance, like doing as you are told by someone else. And there aren't that many ways of saying no or kind of self-asserting that are considered proper. And I think when we kind of now have more of these like sort of say incel groups or online and like alt-right people talking about wanting to go back to a different time, sometimes what that means is they want to go back to a time when it was harder for someone to say no, or where if you performed the right like steps of behavior, then you would kind of unlock this prize because you've hit the right sequence of buttons, and therefore what comes out is someone who says yes. But actually a lot of that behavior it was all kind of coded as consenting. One of the things I looked at in the book was sort of some more kind of present day or more recent legal theory, and just kind of philosophy around consent and making can you make reasonable mistakes to think that someone's consented but get it wrong, and how does that fit in? And there was a study that was talking about how people are more likely to misread consent if someone's like refusal of consent is done softly or equivocally. They're more likely to assume that it's not really a kind of a put off, and if they've got an interest in the outcome as well, like if there's an answer that they want you to have, they're more likely to interpret your behavior as signaling that answer. So we kind of see that even now we're more likely to read people's behavior as agreeing with like what we want it to be, and to misunderstand it as being a maybe rather than a no if they're not being too forceful. And we know that it's not necessarily safe to be like particularly explicit in turning someone down, because that's not necessarily a safe thing to do. It can make people angry. It can increase the level of violence in the situation you're in. So you kind of get this real, just like very messy scenario where a lot of how you are supposed to behave isn't safe anyway, because it sort of all comes back to this like compliance obedience framework. But if you don't know what your risks are, you really can't there's no way to navigate that remotely okay, because you will just perform all these behaviors of acceptance and obedience that will look like you're then completely on board with what's happening, but you don't understand what's happening.
I think that's part of what really I appreciated about your book is just sort of the looking at this 18th century situation, like both in the novels, but then also in the courts and things, and then looking at what people are up to today, and how I do think that part of what you were just saying, where people wish they could go back to a time when they think things were more black and white. It was more clear what was happening. You knew how a man was supposed to behave at a party and how a woman was supposed to behave at a party, and everybody understood what those behaviors meant. But what your book really shows is that no one ever really did. Like if we think we want to go back to a time when things were more cut and dry, it's like, well, it wasn't. It's just you think that it was because you knew that there was this code of expected society, but there's so much wiggle room within that. And like you said, so much of that code was just women being nice and saying, okay. That didn't mean that they meant it. That didn't mean that they wanted it. Like I don't know. It's just something about how people like to dress up like it's the Regency era, which I have nothing against. I think it's lovely. I think it's a fun thing to do. But to imagine that things were at all better than they are now.
I think a lot of it comes down to, so we're talking about like adaptations and watching things on like Bridgerton or a lot of the Austen adaptations, and I love them, and I think they're great. But I also think that's how we picture the time period. And the thing is that if we all went back in time, we probably wouldn't be those people. We'd probably be the people like washing their clothes and cleaning up the horse poo off the roads and like fixing things and doing the laundry and doing all the manual work, because the bracket of society that is those people, we still have a bracket of society that is the very rich today. It's just that, we don't think of it like that. So we look at the protagonists in the adaptations and we identify with them, but they're not who we would be. And I think one of the things that people look for in that or A Simpler Time is that it's the kind of the chance to wear nice clothes and go to dances and to not have to have a job and to not have your emails ding like every 30 seconds with another thing that you have to do, and not to have to worry about climate change and not to have to worry about the kind of geopolitics of the world. Although the character, like, that is very much in the novel still, like that there is political unrest, there is a war coming, like they're written after this war has just happened and then kind of imagined just before it a lot of the time. Like we see that, but we kind of what we're saying is we want to be somewhere where we don't have to worry about money and we don't have to worry about the business of living and the day-to-day difficulties. And I think that's like that, of course we would like to be able to do that. But if we were in the 18th century, even if we were, let's say we were going to be Elizabeth Bennet, you know, we are in a small village where we've got kind of a couple of friends and they're the main people we see, and we can't really see that many more people because we're geographically limited, unless we kind of pack up our trunks and kind of go and spend weeks and weeks and weeks in our friend's house, like going to your kind of, you've got a smaller social circle around you than you might have now. We don't have the same like ability to communicate over distance as quickly. If you don't like the circle of people you're stuck with, you are still stuck with them. It's going to be cold in your house. You know, you're going to have fires to heat it, but you can't just whack the radiator on. Once it gets dark, you're kind of limited to candles. So that means that, you know, it gets dark quite early in the UK. You're going to be, if you want to read or you want to sew or you want to do something, it's either going to be quite expensive to keep the light going, or you're going to be really like squinting and kind of focusing on that. If you've got any kind of health issue, you know, like a lot of so many health issues, particularly around like women's reproductive health, are just not recognized at this point, and they're not known about, or allergies, anything like that. You're going to be just living in a much less you know, you can't just pop to the opticians and get glasses as easily as you can now, and you have to be able to afford them, and you have to be able to, it's just, there's a lot of the day-to-day that you don't write into the novel because it's the normal day-to-day thing, in the same way that, you know, a contemporary romance might not explain all the like realities of living today unless it's also focusing very specifically on, you know, like being in a terrible flat or something. Like, unless that's a key focus of the book, it's just going to be living today, and you might look at it and go, oh, the internet and takeaway foods available at your beck and call, and you could be warm and you have enough clothes and you've got vaccines. And so, you know, you might be looking from the past and seeing all these kind of this wealth that we have of having spices on your food and having dental hygiene that's, you know, good, and having medical options that don't require a leech to like drink half your blood. It's great, but then they wouldn't understand what it's like having your boss call you constantly when you're supposed to be off, or like deep fakes and AI and the kind of rabbit hole of the internet. That wouldn't be something you'd intrinsically know, but you do know if you live in this time.
Well, and that's why I think that your book is so valuable, because what you're doing is, like your title says, like reading between the lines. You know, the stuff that the people reading the book all just inherently know, but we don't. So just to sort of say, this is, like you were saying, you know, like if we're watching the opening of CSI and the person's walking down the dark alley, we all know those risks. So to be reading one of these books, like everybody reading it would know if you run away with a man, or if you go to meet him in the woods at night, like here's what that means. But to me, I'm like, okay, go into the woods at night, sure. Like I think it's so valuable what you've done to sort of explain sort of the context of all of this, but then also the way that you put it within the context of the actual, you know, court records and stuff. I just think it's so valuable. I think it's such a important book, and thank you so much for talking with me about it.
No, thank you for having me on. It's lovely to get to chat.
So if you want to keep up with Zoe, she is on social media. She's on Instagram at thezhm_rights. If you just look up Zoë McGee, she is there. And she's got lots of events coming up, or she has been doing various events talking about this book, being on other podcasts and stuff. And I think it's such a valuable, important thing to braid into our understanding of the Regency era, both just for this season of this podcast, but for all of us in general. I think there's really lovely things, like she was saying in the interview, about imagining going back to a historical time period and how nice and lovely it would be for almost everybody. It would probably not be that lovely except for the mega wealthy, really. But there's nothing wrong with thinking about that and loving to read books that imagine this in a romantic way and watching movies like that. But I just think when one starts to conflate that beautiful vacation version of history with what it was actually like, that's where you get a slippery slope of people wanting to return to certain gender roles or to certain amounts of women's power and agency, because it's not knowing the truth or more of the truth of more aspects of history, I think, just is only a good thing in general. And I think this book is so well written and so interesting. And it's also, parts of it are really funny, like when she's talking about the Ophelia book. Anyway, everybody should read it. We're coming up on a gift-giving season. This would be a fabulous gift to give to anybody. Another fabulous gift to give to anybody would be my book, Rebel of the Regency. What? The Regency era? Is that what you're talking about it, Anne? Maybe. My book is called Rebel of the Regency, The Scandalous Saga of Caroline of Brunswick, Britain's Uncrowned Queen. It comes out in February. So you might be like, how can I give that as a gift? It doesn't actually exist as an item. Well, you could give to somebody as a gift a pre-order of the book, or yourself. Give yourself the gift. If you go onto any of the major book ordering websites, you should be able to order a copy. Or if you go to my website, rebeloftheregency.com, all the links are there as well. So you can pre-order it. And then you give somebody a little slip being like, I owe you this book. Like when you were a kid and you gave your mom as a present a book of like coupons for hugs, kind of like that. But also if you do pre-order it, you do get stuff that you could give to a person as well. For instance, so when you pre-order the book and just, send me a message to show me the evidence, the literal receipt that you've pre-ordered the book, then I can provide you with things that you could give somebody as a gift, like a year's membership to my Substack, a year's membership to my Patreon, a Caroline of Brunswick digital paper doll. Yes, it's a digital file. You could print it and give it to somebody. Thinking outside the box. You can get all the information about my book and also the form where you can submit your receipt at, again, rebeloftheregency.com. And honestly, the more I learn about other things happening in the Regency, the more I'm just like, was Caroline of Brunswick, the character in my book, was she even that much of a rebel? It's like everyone was just messy as hell, honestly. And she was just honest about it. And that's why people were sort of calling her out. Anyway, we're continuing on with Regency things. Next week, we're going to be looking at another scandalous person of the Regency era. And I think consent issues play a major part in this person's story, which is actually revisiting someone who we looked at before, but with our new understanding of the Regency. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, scripted, and hosted by Anne Foster. Editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. Regency era artwork by Karen Moynihan. Social media videos by Magdalena Denson. Transcripts of this podcast are available at vulgarhistory.com by Aveline Malik. You can get early, ad-free episodes of Vulgar History by becoming a paid member of our Patreon at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. Vulgar History merchandise is available at vulgarhistory.com/store for Americans and at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com for everyone else. Follow us on social media at Vulgar History Pod. Get in touch with me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com.
Goodbye, Kyle!
Did the sound of those words call to you like Pavlov's dog? Then you might enjoy our podcast, Turtle Time.
Every week, you can join me, Riley Hamilton, and my co-host, Amy Scarlotta, as we cover the most pressing Bravo news and dig into the new episodes to answer important questions like, who the hell is Adrian Malouf in this world?
Listen to Turtle Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes every Wednesday and Friday.
If you love those, wait, what? Moments, you'll love Something You Should Know. I'm Mike Carruthers, and on my podcast, we explore the fascinating ideas hiding in plain sight, like how elevators change the entire world, how gravity affects your health more than you think, or how to instantly become a better conversationalist. Each episode is fast, fun, and full of insight you'll want to share. So give it a try. Search for Something You Should Know wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, Tom.
Okay, so you want to tell him, or you want me to tell him?
No. I got this. People out there.
Yeah.
People, lean in. Get close. Listen, here's the deal.
We got big news.
We got monumental news. We got snacktacular news.
Yeah, after a brief hiatus, my good friend Michael Ian Black and I are coming back.
My good friend Tom Cavanaugh and I are coming back to do what we do best.
What we were put on this earth to do.
To pick a snack.
To eat a snack.
And to rate a snack.
Scientifically.
Emotionally.
Spiritually.
Mates is back.
Mike and Tom Eat Snacks is back.
A podcast for anyone with a mouth.
With a mouth. Available wherever you get your podcasts.